everybody. Welcome back to another episode of A Thousand Words or Less, show where I talk with other authors about their work and where they get to share a little bit from it. The only catch is, it has to be 1,000 words or less. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and follow us here on the channel because we've got great content coming at you every Sunday. And before we go any further, I do need to tell you, your computer is not broken. You are not seeing double. This month's guest here on 1,000 Words or Less is my twin brother, Brett Odom. Brett, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Glad to be here, Brice.
Great to have you. And as of course my brother knows, and all of my viewers hopefully do as well, one of my books is a study of history on Jimmy Carter, and available at Amazon.com. But because of that, I wanted to bring someone on who could talk more about the academic world of writing, who's a lot more of an expert as I am. And my brother here is a political science scholar who has published multiple papers over the years. And he's a political science scholar whose focus of study is political behavior and how it interacts with various institutions in democracies. Now, Brett, you're going to be reading from for one of your papers today. In fact, correct me if I mess the title up, but it's Raising a Big Tent: Internal Party Dynamics and Leadership Selectorate Expansion. So this is what you're going to be reading up from the beginning of your paper, I believe. And so if you what do we need to know about the paper before you get started?
Yeah, so in layman's terms, the paper tries to explain why parties in parliamentary democracies like the United Kingdom or Canada have chosen to gradually, and sometimes not so gradually, include their wider membership in who is the leader. Traditionally, in these kind of democracies, the political parties would it would be the elites, the elected members of parliament who would get together and they would vote on who would be the leader. This is actually how we still do it in, for example, the House of Representatives in the United States Senate. Democrats do not have throughout the country do not have a say in who is the leader of the Democratic Party in the House. Nancy Pelosi who is the Speaker, is elected by the members of her caucus. That is how it has traditionally been done in most parliamentary democracies. But in the post-war period, from 1945 on, we've seen a trend to where more and more parties have brought in more of their members into this process and created a more democratic selection process.
So, so in other words, how like in the United Kingdom, Labour's former leader was Jeremy Corbyn, who was not very popular with his parliamentary party, but was chosen from the party outside of Parliament.
Correct. He did not have much support. He had a little bit of support in the parliamentary party when he was first elected, but not much. And that has its own implications, which is beyond the scope of this particular paper. But yeah, at the end of the day, it is creating a more democratic process instead of a closed process in the legendary smoke-filled rooms.
Okay. Well, sounds fascinating, and you and I, and for my viewers who've never watched my brother and I sit in a room, we can literally talk about these kind of issues for hours. But we will not be doing it for hours today on this episode. So Brett, go ahead.
Are you sure?
I think my computer might crash if I try to upload an hours long, plural long episode. So that we don't flirt with that, let's go ahead and let you read the excerpt from Raising a Big Tent, and then we'll talk more after you read.
Yeah, so before I read it, I'm just going to provide one last little bit of context, okay, which is that our explanation for why this is happening, and this is what the selection I'm going to read is about. Our explanation for this is that parties tend to do this not just because they've lost power and not just because they have spent time in opposition. All parties do that at some point in parliamentary democracies. What we argue is that when parties have been defeated and become regionalized, where they're really just represented by their regional base, that's when they do this. They do this as a way of reaching out to other parts of the country by including the parts of the party that aren't represented in just the parliamentary party. This was most, and just to illustrate this with an example, the very first party to do this was the Canadian Liberal Party way back in 1919, if I'm getting my date right there. And they'd been beaten to a point where their caucus was overwhelmingly just Quebec MPs. And so in order to make sure that other parts of the country had a say in who the leader was going to be and give some input into the party and the direction of the party, they created a convention system. So members could elect delegates to a leadership convention who would choose the leader. And that anecdote exists across time in all of these countries where we've seen this process, and so when we tested it, we found that this was happening systematically across at least these 5 countries that are in our study. All right. Speaking of that study, what I'm going to be reading here is the introduction to our paper, Raising a Big Tent, which was published in 2016 in Electoral Studies. In 2001, for the first time in the more than century-long history of the United Kingdom's Conservative Party, Tory activists and members across Britain voted to determine the leader of their party. Previously, this decision had been reserved only to Tory members of Parliament. The change in rules, on its surface, seems to be a remarkable diffusion of power by party elites to the grassroots. Yet this willing reduction in elite power was hardly unique. The Tories had joined the ranks of a sizable collection of parties throughout the Commonwealth, which had adopted similar practices. Beginning with the 1919 establishment of a leadership convention by the Liberal Party of Canada, more than a dozen parties in the Westminster system have adopted leadership election rules that include at least some level of membership involvement in the selection of the party leader. While this democratization trend of leadership selection has been noticed by many scholars and has coincided with the democratization of candidate selection, it is not universal amongst parliamentary democracies. The major parties of Australia and New Zealand have largely shied away from such delegations of power. Fianna Fáil, the party which has ruled Ireland for much of the Republican era, still reserves the leadership decisions to its parliamentary party. Many of the explanatory factors proposed in the existing research, being in opposition and the loss of elections and power, are almost certainly contributors to the decision by parties to expand leadership electorates. Yet these are common experiences to all parties in parliamentary systems. As explanations, they fail to establish the logic behind the willing transfer of power from elites to the membership. Cross and Blaise, in their study of leadership elections, suggest an important possible explanation. Selected expansion will occur when a party has become regionalized and must reach out to a more diverse set of voices. This paper seeks to systematically test that explanation through a study of the same national political parties first explored by Cross and Blaise. These parties are from 5 nations in the Westminster tradition during the post-war period: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. When a party has suffered a magnitude of defeat that leaves it shut out of large swaths of the country, its elites will agree to transfer some of their leadership selection prerogatives in order to include input from those regions of the country not represented in the parliamentary party and reinvigorate the party grassroots. In essence, they become willing to cede some internal party power to ensure the revival of the party and improve their chances of regaining governmental power. Thus, it is not mere electoral defeat or occupation of the opposition benches that propels the selectorate rule changes, but rather it is the result of a magnitude of defeat that imperils the future of the party by reducing the party to its regional base.
All right. As I said, you and I can talk about these kind of things for quite some time. So I, of course, find this fascinating. I hope my viewers do as well. But you and I, before we started the episode, talked about the questions we were going to talk about. We really wanted to talk about kind of the general process of academic writing. And so, like, first off, how do you choose a topic? So, like, how did this topic specifically, or your broader topic of study in general, How did you come to to that field and to individual topics in a paper?
Well, that's a little bit complicated because at a certain point you get down the research rabbit hole and one paper leads to another. This one was the start of a particular rabbit hole, though, and it is really a matter, this one very much so is a combination, though, of my long-term historical interest and crazy random happenstance. I was checking out books as part of research for another paper. I believe it was actually my prospectus for the later stages of my graduate school. And I just happened to come across a great book, 2012 book by Cross and Blaise called Politics at the Center. It was a systematic study of leadership elections and the rules of leadership elections in these 5 countries. It was fascinating. It was because of the ins and outs of my department. It was a subfield of comparative politics, the study of politics across nations, that I had not been able to study, despite the fact that it was something that intuitively is exactly what I should be studying. I'm an elections person, and specifically elections institutions, and as you described, institutions of behavior. And how those two things interact. For example, I have another paper that was published based off a paper I wrote for a class, and we got it published. That was about how the rules of the game affect how senators vote on filibuster motions. So those are the rules of the game is something that interests me a lot. That's kind of the governing connective tissue of my work. But I was principally Americanist at the time I picked up this book, but I am long time interested in parliamentary politics and in the history of these countries. And so I picked it up entirely on a fluke. I was like, you know what? This just seems like good beach reading. I literally read this book on the beach. This was entirely for fun. And while sitting there on the beach, I got to this chapter that talks about the expansion process. Why do parties expand the leadership? And it occurred to me as I'm reading it that their explanations for what happened, things like losing power and being in opposition, these were things that all parties go through. Mm. So there wasn't really a great compelling reason why these parties did it, but they mention an anecdote multiple times from multiple different countries, a similar anecdote that parties had done this because they'd gotten regionalized, because they'd taken a big beating and now they needed to find a way to reach out to people outside of their traditional heartlands. But they didn't test that theory. It was just an anecdote they mentioned several times. They kind of went qualitatively through these. They had some models, some statistical models, and our paper is a statistical essay. But they had mentioned it as they just kind of qualitatively went through a survey of the 5 countries. Mm-hmm. And so we were like, well, let's test that theory, because that seems to be a really compelling explanation for what's happening here. In a way that the explanation that these two very, very good scholars had not done. Okay. Actually, it was one of the very first conversations with now one of my best friends, Chase Meyer. He and I wrote this paper together. We split up and we were like, yeah, let's do it. And we were just 2 grad students who were just overly enthusiastic about critiquing a chapter by 2 leading scholars in the subfield.
Oh, Brett, we've lost you there.
Yep. There we go. There we go. We'll cut that out of the magic of editing, hopefully. So that's how we found it. So that's how we came to this very particular topic. Now, if you were asking about other papers I have worked on since then, many of them are a direct result of this paper. Chase and I are currently working on another paper that we've presented at conferences, and that is a direct follow-up to this, to where this paper has taken us. So, your work tends to lead to other work. This was the origin of that. It was really just a mixture of my own personal interests finding somebody who I could share that work with, and the crazy random happenstance of picking up a random book at the library. So that is how we came to this particular topic. Like you said, I can talk for hours about British elections. I have talked for hours about British elections. We literally started this video chat before you record by me talking about a by-election in the UK. Like it's like, aha, this is catnip to me.
So
it became a paper.
Yeah. So to my viewers, he went ahead and gave the evidence I was about to give. Yeah, he's not lying when he says he can talk about this. I like to describe my brother as being fluent in the politics of 7 different countries. It might be.
It's very true. Yeah, no, I'm fluent in Canadian and British politics, and conversational, I would say, in quite a few others.
Well, so do not come to a conversation about politics of any country unarmed with this man. But now I want to move on to our next topic that you just brought up, and that is collaboration. This paper is with Chase Meyer, and you've got other work with Chase, and you've got other work with other individuals as well. Prose and poetry is often very solitary. It's very individual. Even the person who will go into a coffee shop and write, which I am definitely guilty of that cliche myself, that's still, just because other people around doesn't mean you're not doing the work alone, even though there's people around you. This is something, though, that is very much not, or at least in a lot of cases anyway. So how do you come to collaborate? Is that necessarily the first option in at least political science, or does it kind of depend on the project?
That is going to vary very wildly depending on what field you're in. If you're in the hard sciences, and I admittedly am not an expert in this field, but broadly speaking, anyone who's remotely involved in a paper is going to be listed as an author. It is rarer to see solo authored papers in the hard sciences, so biology, chemistry, genetics, physics, that kind of stuff, because it's the process of science is much bigger and more involved than it was when Einstein wrote his formulas. Social science, it's still very collaborative. You will see solo papers, in fact, and it is an important thing, especially for those who are still very much involved in the publish or perish of academia. I'm an independent scholar. So I got my MA from the University of Georgia, but I am not an active member of a faculty anywhere or an institution. So I mercifully am free from that pressure to publish or perish, as they say in the field. But that's, and if you are getting solo off publications is very important because it shows a certain skill as a scholar. But many, if not most, papers are arguably still, and I don't know, I say that, I don't know the statistics of it, but many papers are co-authored because we're all busy people. I mean, like, this is right, Chase and I wrote this paper together. We were in grad school. It was a lot easier to collect data on 5 elections and develop, I'm sorry, not 5 elections, on 5 countries of 60 plus years worth of elections. And then from that election data, construct variables we needed to test our hypothesis with a partner. And we divided it up where I did the UK and Canada, he did Australia and New Zealand, and then we flipped a coin for Ireland, and I had to do Ireland. So it worked out very much there. And that side of it, it's real. I personally, I would always rather. And I say this. I'm an independent scholar. I have different incentives in research, but I would argue it's always better to be able to split up the research and data and modeling side with a partner. It makes life easier and gives you someone you're accountable to. The writing side of it, the part that produced the very nice introduction I read earlier, that is That's a little bit different because it depends on the strengths or weaknesses of who you're writing with. With this particular paper, I wrote it in terms of the initial draft. This set us, and I would argue based on experiences with writing other papers, it's better to have at least someone write the initial draft. Maybe certain sections of it are written more by contributors, but the skeleton is written initially, so the whole paper has a single voice. Whereas I have written other papers where it is very much more obvious that multiple people wrote parts of it and stitched it together. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You read plenty of published papers like that. But if you're interested in kind of stitching the whole paper together smoothly, I have found from personal experience, it's best to make sure one person kind of lays the groundwork for everyone.
Okay. Now, speaking of finishing that process, it's getting published. You and I have talked about your triumphs and travails in this particular part before, and because big shock, we're brothers, we talk.
We do?
I know, right? So would you walk my viewers though through briefly though the process of submitting a paper to a journal for publication and how it eventually gets published?
Yeah, so once you have a finished manuscript, you have to decide which journal you're going to publish it in. And there are a couple different considerations that go into that as in academia. One is, of course, what is the paper on? You're going to are you going to submit this to a subfield journal, or are you going to submit this to one of the big generalized journals? The thing about that is different levels of prestige as well. So if you're trying to get into the Journal of Politics, which is a generalized journal, it's also really high profile and really prestigious. It is hard to get a paper published there. So if you're going to go for it, you need to know that your paper is good enough. You need to have that confidence, or you just need to submit it and hope for the best. It's but nonetheless, you are conscious that there are tiers of journals. Below that top tier are 4 or 5 very prestigious journals who themselves do have little things that they emphasize. So if you're writing a paper that the focus is on the methodology, you might want to go in this journal versus that journal. But nonetheless, there are 4 or 5 big generalized journals. And I am, of course, to be clear, talking very specifically about the political science process. This will vary, of course, if you are in different social sciences and in different hard sciences.
Of course.
If you're not going for there, then you're most likely going to look at one of the subfield journals. And there is yet to get, so subfields meaning I'm publishing a paper on Congress. So which are the journals that publish congressional papers? I'm publishing a paper on comparative elections. So which journals deal with that? And then once again, once you've even figured out where the subfield journals, there are tiers there too. Mm-hmm. So elections, this paper got published in 2016 Electoral Studies. That is a very good journal in the subfield of comparative elections. So we're very proud of it. But it's not a straightforward process to getting published. In academia, you submit to a journal and you are either given a desk rejection, which generally just comes with the thank you, but this doesn't fit our needs at this time, which can mean any number of things, but it's essentially a rejection without any real feedback. More often than not, there is no real feedback. Or you are given to a panel of reviewers. Typically, that is 3 in political science. I can't speak for anyone else, but typically that means three reviewers are going to look at the paper, and they are going to provide you some feedback about what can be done to improve the paper. Hopefully, a bit about what they like about the paper as well, though not everyone is that generous. And then either your paper will be rejected, or generally if it is not rejected, it's given what's called an R&R, a revise and resubmit. So you haven't been rejected yet, but you also haven't been accepted. If you make the changes that the reviewers have asked for, you have a stronger chance of going from R&R to accepted. We actually, with this paper, we were rejected initially with reviews from a different journal. That's very common. I can't speak for everyone, but just from talking to people and everything, it's more common than not to be rejected at least once before you get published. And part of that's just because that's part of the feedback process, and that does generally help papers. Now, so we got rejected in a journal, then we submitted to the journal. We did get published in Electoral Studies. We got, unfortunately, Electoral Studies at the time, I don't know about now, had quite a backlog, was very slow moving. So we ended up getting, but we did end up getting an R&R after quite a wait after submitting it. And so we made changes and approved the paper and submitted again. And after yet another lengthy wait, we got notified we were accepted to the journal. That is about as smooth a process as you can expect from an academic process of publication. I have another paper that we got. I think it might have even been 3 R&Rs. So we went back and forth with the reviewers 3 times before getting published, and that might even it took 3 times going back and forth. So it's not necessarily a straightforward process. And at any point, just because you get an R&R does not mean you'll be accepted. You may make changes, and there's still not enough for the reviewers, and you find yourself back on the street having to go find the next journal, but hopefully with a better paper.
Okay.
And so that's the broad process, and that's the great thing about the formal process of peer-reviewed research in academic writing. It is institutionalized to have feedback at most levels, whether you're presenting the paper at a conference, which is how a lot of people will start with a paper. They'll take it to a conference so they can get some initial feedback before trying to publish it. Mm-hmm. And then, unless you were desk rejected, you're generally going to get some kind of feedback from a process, even if it's not published. And so each rejection is a signpost on how to improve your work. Chase and I have a paper we just submitted. It got rejected initially with a desk rejection. We didn't get any feedback, but we took that as a sign that things needed to change in the paper. And so we sat down and went, all right, it got a desk rejection. So what do we think the problems with the paper are, and what can we address now? And we made some decisions about what we thought was important to address. And we made decisions about what we weren't going to change too. We're like, all right, we're not going to play in that paper. For example, we said, we're not going to play with any of the statistics. We have no feedback that says one way or the other what that is. And so we think it's best to leave that there until we have solid feedback saying this is what needs to change, versus things about how we framed the question, how we wrote the paper, how we discussed hypotheses, and those kind of things. Those we messed with and tinkered with and revised on our own. And we're like, all right, so these are things that if I was a reviewer of this paper, I think would be an issue. And so even when there is, in the absence of feedback, is its own kind of feedback. It's still a sign that work still needs to be done.
Okay. All right. Well, viewers, and Brett, Raising a Big Tent, what journal was this published in again?
This was published in 2016 in Electoral Studies.
So if you would like to read the full paper, you can go online and find find a copy of Raising a Big Tent in that particular issue of Electoral Studies. Somehow, some way, I am sure. And as I personally find it all fascinating, I recommend you go ahead and check Brett and his collaborator Chase out, because they are both fantastic people, brilliant scholars, and deserve to be accepted in every journal. But
I agree. It's Meyer and Odom 2016, Raising a Big Tent, Internal Party Dynamics, and Leadership Electorate Expansion, for those of you going to Google Scholar to find it.
Well, if I'll put a link to. I'll put a link. I'll find it myself, and I'll put a link in the description for everybody. Now, Brett, thank you for coming on. We have definitely flirted with talking for hours. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up here. Again, everyone, please make sure if you're interested in the academic writing area, take a look at this paper. One, it's brilliant, but two, it'll also give you a good idea of the style and substance of academic writing. And Brett is a fantastic academic writer. Brett, thank you very much for coming on and joining with us. Thank you for doing this favor for your brother. Next time you get something published, we'll have you back on to celebrate.
Well, thank you, Brice. I'm glad I could be here, and thank you for the chance to talk with your viewers.
All right. Well, everybody, again, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because we've got new content here on the channel every Sunday. So please join us next week. But Brett, thanks so much, and everyone, y'all have a wonderful day.